On the morning of August 9, 1945, the air raid siren sounded in the Japanese city of Nagasaki. However, shortly afterward, the siren sounded again, indicating that there was no danger and people began to leave their shelters to resume their daily activities. The Japanese spotters had only identified 2 bombers, B-29s from the United States Army Air Forces, and they had previously flown to the city of Kokura without dropping any weapons, so the Japanese authorities assumed it was simply a reconnaissance mission. They couldn't have known what was coming for them. Just like the people of Kokura couldn't have known that they had been spared a terrible fate that morning, thanks to something as simple as the clouds that darkened their city. At 11:01 a.m., a single bomb was dropped on the industrial area of the city. The bomb detonated with a force equivalent to 22,000 tons of TNT, resulting in an explosion so bright that it was seen by observers more than 100 miles away. The fireball generated temperatures exceeding 3,900 degrees Celsius and produced winds of up to 600 miles per hour, which contributed to the destruction. The exact numbers are unclear, but at least 129,000 people died that day, or would die in the weeks and years that followed. 6 days after the attack, Japan surrendered to the Allies, bringing an end to the most destructive conflict in recorded history, which concluded with the first, and so far only, 2 nuclear attacks in history. It was World War II. In this, the first of a 2-part special, we are going to examine some of the elements and incidents key to what is probably the most influential conflict in the course of human history. Welcome to Wars of the World. Given the complex nature of history, especially in relation to an event as momentous as World War II, it is difficult to trace a single event that sparked the conflict, since ultimately, it was a series of events that conspired together to finally ignite the flame of war. However, one factor that certainly played a significant role was fascism and similar ultranationalist ideologies that emerged in the 1920s and 1930s, often fueled by the consequences of World War I. In many ways, the fascist rise during this period can be considered a remnant of the old imperial forms of kings, queens, and emperors, since the followers of such ideology believed in the concept of destiny, racial superiority, and having a place within a hierarchy, which more often than not led to a supreme leader who guided them toward what they saw as that destiny of greatness. The 3 main actors whom history labels as the principal instigators of the war, the Federal Republic of Germany, Italy, and Japan, shared this common worldview, even when their own stricter interpretations of that vision clashed with those of their fascist allies. Furthermore, they all shared another belief, that there were those who stood in their way of achieving their destiny, and that these individuals had to be destroyed. Of these 3 world powers, Japan was already on the path toward ultranationalism by the end of World War I. Although allied with America, the United Kingdom, and the French Republic, they received little respect from the old imperial powers, who seemed to stand in their way of achieving dominance over Asia, whether militarily or through Western-imposed treaties that greatly favored the United Kingdom and Washington. Therefore, much of Japan's rearmament program, and in particular research into chemical and biological weapons, was carried out in secret, at least initially, driven by a culture that was becoming increasingly militaristic, inspired by the old customs of the Japanese samurai and the way of the warrior. Similarly, Italy was also undergoing something of an ideological revolution, hoping to reclaim past glory and establish a new international identity as a leading power. In 1922, Mussolini and his National Fascist Party came to power in Italy. Very soon after, he began to reshape the country's political democratic landscape into a dictatorship centered around himself. Mussolini believed that the destiny of his new Italy was to give birth to a new Roman Empire, and he began a massive military buildup. A difficult task, given that Italy's economy was still largely centered on agriculture rather than the manufacturing base needed for such grand plans. With both nations now ready to pursue their ambitions, conflict was inevitable. History indicates that the Second World War began in 1939. However, some historians now argue that it began in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in the People's Republic of China, in an effort to seize vital resources. The Japanese deliberately detonated a bomb on a Chinese railway line used by Japanese citizens in order to blame Chinese dissidents. This was then used as a pretext to invade the country, and Japan would occupy the land there until it was liberated by the Allies in 1945, waging an almost unceasing war with the Chinese government. The entire time, the Japanese occupation of Chinese territory was extraordinarily harsh. Rape and murder were not only widespread, but were often encouraged by the Japanese leadership as a form of recreation for the troops. In Japanese society, surrender was unthinkable, as it would bring dishonor to the family, and they applied this code to the Chinese as well. Chinese prisoners who did not fight to the death were treated brutally, either killed on the spot or worked to death, while some particularly unfortunate victims might find themselves sent to one of Japan's medical research facilities that had been built in the People's Republic. Occupied China. Located in Pingfan, in the northeast of the People's Republic of China, and designated as Unit 731, thousands of Chinese prisoners were used in gruesome medical experiments to develop biological and chemical weapons, as well as to perform experimental surgeries, often without anesthesia for fear of corrupting the data, all for the sake of the empire. Mussolini was also unafraid to use his forces to build his empire, especially when he sent troops to Ethiopia, present-day Ethiopia, in 1935. To begin the construction of his new Roman Empire in Africa, if it can be argued that Manchuria is considered the first battlefield of World War II, then Ethiopia could be the second. Of course, it was the third fascist country to emerge that would become the main protagonist of this story, the Federal Republic of Germany, Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler. Hitler himself was of Austrian origin, but he had fought in the German army during World War I. When the war ended with the humiliation of the Federal Republic of Germany, Hitler felt especially bitter, and like many in Europe, he feared that communism would spread beyond the borders of post-revolutionary Russia. In 1919, a year after the end of the war, he joined a new and little-known political group called the German Workers' Party, and used his great skill as a speaker to stir up crowds and gain support. A year later, the party was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known by its English abbreviation, Nazi. In 1921, Hitler rose to become the leader of the party, and once again, using his magnetic personality, he continued to gain more and more support, until in 1923, the German Nazis were confident enough to attempt a coup d'etat in Munich and seize power. Known as the Beer Hall Putsch, the effort failed, and Hitler was arrested before being put on trial, but this only further fueled the cause. Nazi Germany. Hitler used the trial to gain even more followers, and despite spending a year in prison, during which he wrote his autobiography, Mein Kampf, the German Nazis struggled to establish themselves in German politics. Mein Kampf not only outlined Hitler's own story, but also set out to establish his vision for the future of the German people, and how he believed that subversive groups were holding them back from achieving their destiny. Through measures such as the Treaty of Versailles, which outlined the terms of the surrender of the Federal Republic of Germany, he specifically identified Jews and communists as the leaders of this great international conspiracy to keep the German people oppressed after the war, highlighting the harsh conditions imposed on the country by the victorious Allies. The book effectively became the Nazi Bible in 1933. The Nazi Party gained enough political support for Hitler to legally become Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. He quickly began passing legislation that would transform the Federal Republic of Germany into the Federal Republic of Germany, Nazi, and the swastika would symbolize this reinvigorated country. The persecution of Jews, Roma, and political opponents soon became government policy. Meanwhile, Hitler began preparing Nazi Germany to achieve what he saw as its destiny. Focused on the concept of the Aryan race, with himself as the undisputed leader, the Führer. As the 1930s progressed, Hitler's Nazi Party became firmly entrenched not only in German politics, but also in German society. The German people had much to thank the Nazi Party for, as they had pulled the country out of the despair of defeat and revitalized it, promising that Germany would soon achieve its destiny of becoming a great power once again. Many foreign observers noticed and admired Hitler's appeal and influence, even beginning to support him. Many sympathized with the post-war treatment of Germany. Hitler would even go on to become Time magazine's Man of the Year. This played perfectly into Hitler's hands, as he began to make references to reclaiming the territories lost in the east and west of the country. The first test of how the Allied powers of the United Kingdom and France would respond to his new Germany came in 1935, when Hitler introduced military conscription, which caused the German armed forces to grow many times beyond the number allowed by the Treaty of Versailles. However, the Allies did nothing. Encouraged by this, Hitler also joined Mussolini in sending troops to fight for the nationalists in the Spanish Civil War, giving his forces vital combat experience. In 1937, British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin resigned and was succeeded by Neville Chamberlain. Meanwhile, the Federal Republic of Germany continued to rearm. And now he set his sights on reclaiming the German Sudetenland, which had been absorbed by Czechoslovakia after the war. Hitler tried to have his native country, the Republic of Austria, join his new Federal Republic of Germany, despite this being forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. The Republic of Austria and the Federal Republic of Germany had long had an almost symbiotic relationship, and the people of both countries saw each other as cousins. The Republic of Austria had its own Nazi German party. In January 1938, they attempted a coup similar to the one Hitler had tried in 1923. The Nazi German coup in the Republic of Austria failed, resulting in many leaders being imprisoned. Hitler's propaganda machine went into action, creating a false impression that the Austrians were rising up in support of their Germany. Nazi leaders were imprisoned. Therefore, on March 12, 1938, German troops entered the Republic of Austria, supposedly to restore order. Within a matter of weeks, the Austrian government disappeared, and the country was absorbed by the Federal Republic of Germany as the province of Austria. A vote on the union with the Federal Republic of Germany claimed that 99% of the population supported the measure, which became known as the annexation. Having secured his homeland under a Federal Republic of Germany, furthermore, Hitler declared himself the defender of all ethnic Germans in Europe, and especially those in the Sudetenland. He made his intention to absorb the region clear. In the Federal Republic of Germany, a diplomatic crisis broke out when, just as in Austria, a party, the Nazi Germany Party in the Sudetenland, rose up and began to demand autonomy from Czechoslovakia. The Czech government tried to negotiate with the Sudetenland Germans, while a series of meetings were held between the Federal Republic of Germany, the United Kingdom, and the French Republic to reach an agreement on the crisis, culminating in the Munich Agreement, which effectively gave the Federal Republic of Germany a free hand for its ambitions. No Czech representative was present. First, Hitler took the Sudetenland, and then, in January 1939, he invaded and captured the rest of Czechoslovakia, in his first truly open act of aggression against a neighbor. The conquest of Czechoslovakia raised concerns in the powerful Soviet Union, which was in the grip of the paranoid Joseph Stalin. Hitler had written in Mein Kampf that having to fight on two fronts, it was one of the reasons why the Kaiser's German Empire was defeated. And so, having already antagonized the United Kingdom and Paris, he was much more cautious with Moscow and began a diplomatic effort with the Soviet Union to keep them out of events in the West. In August 1939, the foreign ministers of the German Reich and the Soviet Union, they met in Moscow, where they effectively divided Eastern Europe in two, with the promise that neither would interfere with the other in those areas. The Soviet Union had its own interests in the Republic of Poland and Finland, and therefore was happy to abide by the agreements, even though the German Reich, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union were ideological enemies. Despite this period of cooperation, many felt it wouldn't last, but with Stalin kept in check, Hitler ordered his troops to enter the Republic of Poland on September 1, 1939. The invasion of the Republic of Poland was the last straw for the United Kingdom and the French Republic. There was no justification for the invasion, other than simply seizing territory from a foreign land. And so, the Allied powers delivered an ultimatum to Hitler: withdraw his troops, or there would be war. The demand was rejected, and on September 3, Neville Chamberlain told the British people that they were at war with the Federal Republic of Germany. Some of the more cautious generals had large submarine fleets and powerful attack forces. Therefore, the generals devised their blitzkrieg style of warfare. Blitzkrieg means lightning, and it required the widespread use of tanks and airplanes to break through enemy formations, capture key strategic areas, and split enemy forces to make their destruction easier. Above all, it was intended to achieve a quick victory rather than a prolonged war of attrition that the Federal Republic of Germany could not afford. It was used for the first time in the Republic of Poland, and the Polish army proved completely inadequate for this new form of warfare. In less than a month, the Polish army was annihilated, and the German army, the Wehrmacht, began to consolidate its positions in the west of Poland, while the Soviet Union invaded the eastern part of the country on September 17, as had been agreed upon by Stalin and Hitler. This was something that was practically ignored by the United Kingdom and France, who focused on the Federal Republic of Germany. Poland ceased to exist as a free country on October 6, 1939. And the Federal Republic of Germany, Nazi Germany, now shared a land border with the Soviet Union. Communist. The declaration of war by the United Kingdom and France against the Federal Republic of Germany sent shockwaves throughout Europe, which were felt politically, but seemed to do little else. The Kingdom of Belgium, the Netherlands, and the Kingdom of Norway joined a chorus of European voices declaring themselves neutral in the conflict. But in fact, there seemed to be very little fighting at all. In terms of helping to defend Poland, the United Kingdom and France could do very little, and instead prepared for when Hitler would turn westward. This was the beginning of the Phony War, a period in which both sides seemed to be doing everything they would normally do in war, except for waging all-out war. The French mobilized their armed forces and sent them to the border, while the United Kingdom created the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, to be sent across the Channel to support the French Republic, mirroring how the country entered the war in 1914. At sea, German submarines and surface raiders sank unprotected merchant ships, while in the air, British planes carried out attacks on German shipping or dropped leaflets over the Ruhr region. During one of these leaflet-dropping missions, on September 9th, a formation of Whitley bombers from the Royal Air Force, was diverted into Belgian airspace and was attacked by Belgian fighters, which forced one of them to land, but they lost 2 planes to defensive British defensive fire. However, in the Atlantic, off South Africa, a drama was about to unfold that would become a naval legend. The German battleship Graf Spee was attacking and sinking British merchant ships, capturing their crews. The crews were transferred to the Altmark, the Graf Spee support ship. On its way back to Germany, 3 British cruisers encountered the German ship in battle, and despite being at a disadvantage, they managed to inflict enough damage to force the German battleship to enter port for repairs. While it was docked, the British saturated the local media with news of a large British fleet preparing to destroy the pocket battleship as soon as it left port. The German captain learned of this, and believing the situation to be hopeless, he scuttled his powerful warship. In reality, there was no fleet, but the deception potentially saved thousands of sailors' lives. A few weeks later, British special forces raided the Altmark and rescued several crews from captured merchant ships. Everyone knew that the phony war couldn't last forever, and it was only a matter of time before Hitler attacked westward toward the French Republic. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom and the French Republic decided to embark on a campaign in the Kingdom of Norway, at that time a neutral country, but one that, along with the Kingdom of Sweden, was helping to supply the Federal Republic of Germany with vital iron ore. The Allies mined the Norwegian ports from which German ships operated. This prompted Hitler to send his forces on April 9th to secure them. At the same time, Hitler's forces attacked the Kingdom of Denmark, taking the country in less than 6 hours. The battle for the Kingdom of Norway lasted until June 10th, by which time the French Republic and the United Kingdom had already withdrawn, leaving the country defenseless. By doing so, he effectively suspended British democracy for the foreseeable future. He told the people of the United Kingdom rather bluntly that he had nothing to offer them but blood, toil, tears, and sweat across the Channel. The French had been preparing for another great war against the Federal Republic of Germany for more than a decade. They built the Maginot Line, a series of extremely tough fortifications along the border with the Federal Republic of Germany. It was designed and constructed with the belief that the war would resemble the static nature of the First World War. But it was fundamentally flawed. It only extended as far as the border with the Kingdom of Belgium. And despite the popular belief at the time, it was not a continuous fortification as it had several gaps, where it was believed that natural obstacles, such as forests and hills, would provide protection. It also consumed enormous amounts of men and resources, which led some to worry that the French were putting all their eggs in one basket, as far as the defense of their nation was concerned. Hitler observed the situation and immediately saw what he had to do. He was simply going to bypass it entirely, going through Belgium and the Netherlands. Just like the Kaiser before him in 1914, he paid little attention to Belgium's declaration of neutrality, or anyone else's, if it served his purpose. On May 10, 1940, the Federal Republic of Germany attacked westward, quickly invading Belgium, the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, and heading toward the heart of France. He had bypassed the Maginot Line. This meant expanding the fight to neighboring countries, and effectively handing over even more of Europe to Hitler. The Germans flooded into France, making good use of their tank and air forces, despite being at a numerical disadvantage on paper. In fact, the Federal Republic of Germany's tank forces were, in many ways, technologically inferior to those of the Allies. In 1940, however, the Germans had far superior tactics. In the air, the United Kingdom and France found themselves vastly outmatched by the famous German fighter Messerschmitt Bf 109 and suffered heavy losses. But it would be another German plane that would gain notoriety during the battle for France. The Ju-87. The Stuka was a famous dive bomber that could attack tanks and bridges with extraordinary precision and power, striking terror into ground units. Later on, the plane would be equipped with a siren on its wings, which would create a terrifying howl when diving to scare troops even more, making it both a psychological weapon and a bomber. To make matters worse for the Allies, the rapid German success and the failure of the Maginot Line, to keep Hitler's forces at bay, they saw that the morale of the French Republic, in particular, suffered terribly. Despite the determined resistance of the French army and the British Expeditionary Force, a sense of defeatism quickly overwhelmed them. It soon became clear that the French Republic would fall, and so in the United Kingdom, plans were made to evacuate the British Expeditionary Force back to the continent so they could defend the United Kingdom from what now seemed like an inevitable invasion. Dubbed Operation Dynamo, a huge armada of fishing boats, pleasure craft, and even rowboats was assembled on the southeast coast of the United Kingdom to make the journey across the Channel to Dunkirk, where the remnants of the British Expeditionary Force and elements of the French and Belgian armies were gathering survivors. In these small pockets along the coast of the French Republic, the British and French troops in Dunkirk were surrounded by German forces and awaited rescue, capture, or death. Hitler wanted to send his troops to finish them off once and for all, but the head of the German Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, convinced him that his air force, which until then had proven to be almost unstoppable, could crush them on the beaches, with fewer losses for the German forces. Göring hoped that by doing this, he would gain favor with Hitler over some of his rivals within the High Command, Nazi Germany. The evacuation began on May 27, 1940, with a fleet of small boats heading to the beaches to take the men to the waiting British warships. The German Luftwaffe launched a fierce aerial bombardment and inflicted painful losses on the British. However, for the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe's superiority was finally challenged, as Dunkirk was within range of fighters flying from Britain itself. The sea and sky thus became a brutal killing field, until the evacuation ended almost a week later, on June 4th, by which time an astonishing 338,000 men had been rescued. The evacuation was seen as a victory for Britain, but those in the halls of power knew the truth. The defeat in France not only cost the relatively small British army 68,000 men, but also enormous amounts of equipment, such as artillery, tanks, and various other vehicles that would be vital to repel a German invasion. Churchill warned against the optimistic mood after Dunkirk, pointing out that wars are not won by evacuations. In the wake of the successful evacuation, a tragedy occurred that has largely been overlooked by history, when the British ocean liner, the RMS Lancastria, tried to escape from the French port of Saint-Nazaire. The liner was taking part in the air operation, which aimed to evacuate British nationals from the French Republic, when, at 10 minutes to 4 on June 17, it was bombed by German planes. The exact number of men, women, and children on board is unknown because, in the chaos of the evacuation, people were crammed together in every available space, but it is estimated that between 3,000 and 6,000 people died, making it the worst maritime disaster in British history. To put this in perspective, even the most conservative estimates place the death toll at twice that of the Titanic. The disaster was quietly covered up out of fear of damaging national morale. On June 10, 1940, Mussolini sided with the Federal Republic of Germany, Nazi Germany, declaring war on the United Kingdom and the French Republic, although Italian forces would play only a symbolic role in the fight for the French Republic. On June 25, 1940, after just 46 days of fighting, Hitler's troops accomplished what the Kaiser could not do in 4 years by defeating and occupying the French Republic. To add insult to injury for the French, Hitler located the very same railway carriage in which the Treaty of Versailles had been signed in 1919, and he used it to meet with the French to discuss their surrender. The French Republic surrendered, but it was not completely occupied by the Federal Republic of Germany. Instead, the country was divided in two, with the Federal Republic of Germany occupying the northern half of the country and the western coast, and the rest in the southeast being governed by the government, Vichy France, which was essentially a German puppet and had to live under terms that had been imposed in a similar way to the Federal Republic of Germany after the First World War. One of its most controversial acts during the war. Thank you. On July 3rd, he ordered the Royal Navy to demand that the French warships surrender to them. And when they refused, the Royal Navy bombarded them with artillery fire, killing 1,297 French sailors and sinking or damaging 8 ships. With the French Republic out of the fight, Hitler was uneasy about what to do with the United Kingdom. He was not in favor of destroying the United Kingdom, since he believed that would only hand its empire over to the United States, who were becoming increasingly hostile toward him after the Republic of Poland. He thought the United Kingdom was exhausted after the fall of the French Republic, so he offered peace, but Churchill rejected it, knowing that the chances of repelling a German invasion in 1940 were minimal. Therefore, Hitler ordered his generals to draw up plans for the operation, Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the United Kingdom. At the same time, the Federal Republic of Germany, together with Mussolini's Italy, met with representatives from Japan to begin negotiations for an alliance that was intended to counter the United States. This ultimately culminated in the Tripartite Pact, signed on September 27, 1940, which marked the birth of what history now remembers as the Axis powers, following a comment previously made by Mussolini, in which he said that the world would revolve on the axis between Germany and Rome, and now of course Japan. Unlike the previous military campaigns of the Federal Republic of Germany, the invasion of the United Kingdom faced a serious obstacle in the English Channel. Hitler's military leadership agreed that it would only be possible to cross the Channel in the summer, since the weather during the autumn and winter months would be too bad to cross safely. First, however, they would have to destroy the Royal Air Force. Otherwise, their troops would be easy targets for the United Kingdom while they were in the Channel, in their invasion barges during the crossing. While the Federal Republic of Germany was making its invasion preparations, Churchill was preparing the country to do whatever was necessary to defend itself. Declassified documents show just how far he was willing to go to repel Hitler's forces if they managed to land in the United Kingdom. He ordered British forces to use chemical weapons in any German landing zone in the country, frequently saying that this is our country and we can do whatever we want to defend it. Previously, he had wanted to use gas in the Battle of the French Republic, dropped from British bombers onto targets in the Federal Republic of Germany. But his top military officers warned him that the Federal Republic of Germany, at that time, could launch much higher levels of gas onto British targets, and so both sides made a tacit agreement that they would only use gas if the other did so. On July 10, 1940, the German Luftwaffe began its offensive to destroy the Royal Air Force. It was the beginning of the Battle of Britain, and German confidence was still high after their swift defeat of the Republic of Poland and Western Europe. However, unlike much of the fighting in Europe, the Luftwaffe now had to contend with a well-organized and highly integrated air defense network, centered on the Royal Air Force's Fighter Command, led by Sir Hugh Dowding. They were equipped with two of the best fighter planes in the world at that time, namely the Hawker Hurricane and the more advanced Supermarine Spitfire. The ranks of Fighter Command were also bolstered by the arrival of volunteer pilots from the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, the Republic of Poland, and even the United States, many of whom already had combat experience from fighting for their own countries. In the coming weeks, the Royal Air Force would rise to face the overwhelming German aircraft, but they would suffer for it, as the Luftwaffe bombed their airfields in an effort to destroy their support infrastructure. On August 13, 1940, so many German planes attacked the United Kingdom that Churchill was warned the invasion was finally underway. But despite the heavy damage inflicted, the Royal Air Force stood firm against the Germans, who were occasionally accompanied by contingents of Italian aircraft. By September, Fighter Command was at its weakest point in terms of both men and machines. But then, with the country's industry now fully geared for war, Britain's fighter production increased to the point where it outpaced losses, and newly trained pilots began joining the fight. Nevertheless, the damage to the airfields was more problematic. On the other hand, Hitler was unaware that the Royal Air Force was regaining its strength, and Goering informed him that they could barely get planes in the air, something that would become true if the pressure on Britain's airfields was not relieved. On August 24, 1940, German bombers accidentally bombed Britain. It is likely that Churchill knew this was a mistake, but he still exaggerated the incident to have an excuse to send his own bombers to Germany. The attacks on Germany enraged Hitler, who decided to order his bombers to shift their focus from the airfields to devastating Britain and other British cities. He believed that British morale would be so shaken by these terror attacks that the country would collapse, forcing Churchill to surrender, which would make an armed invasion unnecessary. It was one of Hitler's greatest mistakes. Essentially freed from attacks, Fighter Command was able to rebuild and reorganize. And by the time Hitler realized his mistake, summer was coming to an end. The weather was getting worse. The Royal Air Force's Fighter Command was still a potent threat, and the country's defenses had been strengthened to the point where invasion was no longer practical. Although the Germans had successfully captured the Channel Islands, the United Kingdom was saved, and thus, in hindsight, the seeds were sown for Hitler's eventual defeat. Just like in the First World War, the outbreak of war in Europe once again saw fighting spill over into territories controlled by the European imperial powers elsewhere in the world. The United Kingdom and the French Republic had territory all across Africa, which Mussolini of Italy eyed with envy. And when Italy declared war on the United Kingdom and the French Republic in support of the Federal Republic of Germany, it gave Mussolini the opportunity to invade those territories from Italian possessions such as Ethiopia, Somaliland, and most significantly, the Republic of Libya, which bordered British-controlled Egypt. The Arab Republic of Egypt was vital to the interests of the United Kingdom because of the Suez Canal, which linked the UK to its possessions in the Far East, such as Hong Kong and India, as well as to the oil-rich Middle East, which both sides desperately needed access to. On September 13, 1940, Italian forces launched an invasion of the Arab Republic of Egypt. With the United Kingdom still preparing for an invasion, it was left to the small contingent of British and Commonwealth troops stationed there to defend the vast border against the numerically superior Italians. At first, the Italians made good progress, eventually capturing the important airfield at Sidi Barrani. However, with Hitler being forced to cancel the invasion of the United Kingdom, fresh troops and equipment began to be mobilized for North Africa under the command of Lieutenant General Ricardo O'Connell. First, however, they would have to make the dangerous sea journey across the Atlantic, North Korea, and enter the Mediterranean, where the Italian fleet was still the dominant force. Despite being at a significant numerical disadvantage, the United Kingdom devised a bold plan to attack the Italian fleet while it was still anchored in the port of Taranto, using obsolete ferry Swordfish biplane bombers. On the night of November 11th and 12th, 1940, the Swordfish bomber force took off from HMS Illustrious and caught the Italians completely by surprise. The attack caused severe damage to a large number of Italian capital ships, putting them out of action for several months for repairs, and thus seriously hindering Italy's efforts to disrupt supplies to North Korea from Africa. Unfortunately, the United Kingdom still had to deal with air and submarine attacks. The task of expelling the Italian forces from the Arab Republic of Egypt seemed immense at the end of 1940, and yet the newly arrived British forces managed to do just that. They recaptured Sidi Barrani, and by January 3, 1941, they were already advancing towards the Republic of Libya. In just 2 months, a British force made up of only 2 divisions had advanced 800 kilometers, destroyed 10 Italian divisions, and taken 130,000 prisoners, as well as capturing more than 1,000 tanks and artillery pieces. Operating from Italy, the German Luftwaffe began to support the Italian operation from the air, but things on the ground continued to go badly for the Italians, with British forces capturing the strategic port of Tobruk on January 22nd. Confident in the Italian defeat, Churchill began his plans to help defend Greece and the Balkans from a joint German and Italian invasion. However, the Federal Republic of Germany decided to send 2 of its own divisions to help reinforce the Italian forces in North Africa, which would form the core of its Africa Corps, under the command of Erwin Rommel. Rommel was a gifted leader and tactician who understood tank warfare better than most generals in 1941. The plains of North Africa were ideal for tank combat, and Rommel's influence was felt almost immediately. Rommel attacked on March 24th and advanced eastward through the Republic of Libya, back toward the Arab Republic of Egypt. However, he failed to retake Tobruk and instead laid siege to the British garrison there, which held out for an astonishing 240 days, providing a severe thorn in the side of the Axis forces and tying up resources. On April 14th, the British and Commonwealth forces had been pushed back to the border, and the Germans had even captured General O'Connor and his replacement, General Newham. But Rommel's forces were dealing with logistical problems, which Hitler feared the United Kingdom might take advantage of. Fuel was such a major concern for the Germans that they began efforts to steal it from the United Kingdom, instead of destroying British reserves in air raids. By May, Rommel was forced to halt his advance while he resupplied his forces. Under General Wavell, the United Kingdom counterattacked in June, hoping to cut off Rommel's supplies and force him to surrender, but Rommel outmaneuvered them and the attack failed. As the year went on, the United Kingdom became obsessed with killing Rommel, who had earned the nickname Desert Fox, and even sent a commando raid to assassinate him, which ultimately failed. Over the following months, the battle lines shifted back and forth, but Rommel's logistical problems continued to hold him back, and worsened when Hitler began to focus more on other fronts. During this time, British forces also found themselves engaged on another unexpected front against the Republic of Iraq. Previously a British possession in the Middle East, the Republic of Iraq gained its independence in 1930 but maintained good relations with the United Kingdom to the extent that it broke off relations with the Federal Republic of Germany when the war broke out. There were British planes and soldiers in the country, protecting British interests such as its regional oil reserves. However, in April 1941, the Germans supported a coup d'etat against the government, which led to a brief conflict between the country's new leaders and the forces of the British Empire. The British forces were ultimately successful despite promises of Axis support, such as German planes flying with Iraqi markings. With Hitler being forced to cancel Operation Sea Lion in 1940, the Germans recognized that their window to invade the United Kingdom had closed, and that attempting another invasion would now be impractical. The United Kingdom became the British stronghold, so Hitler turned to siege warfare, a medieval method of war. Hitler knew that the United Kingdom was extremely dependent on war supplies, materials, and even food that came from its empire and from America, North Korea. Therefore, he turned to his navy, the Kriegsmarine, and tasked them with cutting off this vital supply line. The Royal Navy was still the most powerful surface fleet in the world in 1940, and although the Federal Republic of Germany had advanced warships like the Bismarck, they could not hope to face the Royal Navy in a large-scale battle, as the Kaiser's fleet had done in the First World War. Thus, despite major successes, such as the sinking of the prized British battlecruiser HMS Hood by the Bismarck on May 24, 1941, the German surface fleets were practically irrelevant in the maritime conflict, especially as the war progressed and Hitler lost interest in them. Therefore, the German Navy turned to using its U-boat submarines to lay siege to the United Kingdom. The Kaiser's U-boats revealed the vulnerability of the United Kingdom, but it seems that little was learned from this in the interwar years. The tactics for combating U-boat submarines had changed very little, and new technologies, such as an early form of sonar, were still not widespread in the fleet. This meant that the main method for detecting a U-boat was to spot it on the surface, either while it was recharging its batteries or when it was using its periscope. Although airplanes were considered ideal platforms, the Coastal Command of the Royal Air Force was equipped with inadequate types at the start of the war, lacking both range and armament, and relying solely on the aircrew for detection. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy began organizing merchant ships into convoys to provide them with protection, and also started taking trawlers from the United Kingdom's fishing fleets and arming them to hunt U-boat submarines. However, the U-boats began to inflict painful losses on the United Kingdom, while efforts to destroy the U-boats at sea met with mixed success. Just like the efforts of the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command to destroy U-boat shipyards in the French Republic and the Kingdom of Norway, Churchill would later admit that the U-boats were the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. However, the U-boats needed help to locate the convoys, so the Luftwaffe used long-range Condor patrol planes to coordinate U-boat attacks. The United Kingdom began looking for ways to destroy these planes once they realized this. There weren't enough aircraft carriers in the Royal Navy, at least during the early years, to protect every convoy. So they came up with a novel solution: catapult merchant ships, or CAM ships. These were merchant ships equipped with a catapult to launch a single Hawker Hurricane or Fairey Fulmar fighter to attack the Condors when they were spotted. It was a one-way mission, with no way to recover the plane, which had to land next to the convoy, with the pilots hoping to be picked up by a passing ship, making it one of the most dangerous jobs of the war. The need to fight against the U-boat submarines drove the rapid development of technology, especially in radar. The U-boat submarines recharged their batteries by sailing on the surface under the cover of night. The radar used to combat nighttime bombings was tested against U-boat submarines. On December 22, 1941, a U-boat was sunk by a Royal Navy aircraft in the darkness. From then on, U-boat submarines could be attacked at any time and in any place. The situation worsened for the U-boat submarines with the arrival of new, longer-range aircraft equipped with radar, which left fewer and fewer safe places for them to hide. At the same time that Mussolini's Italy launched the campaign in North Africa, its troops also opened another front, this time against Greece. Mussolini felt that he was playing a secondary role to Hitler in Europe and wanted to establish himself as an equal. He considered Greece an easy target and began to pressure the country's own fascist-style dictator, Ioannis Metaxas. On August 15, 1940, an Italian submarine sank the Greek warship, Elli. Italian troops attacked on October 28, 1940, but similar to North Korea in Africa, they were repelled despite the seemingly favorable odds. The Italian attack strengthened Greece's alliance with the United Kingdom, which was in need of allies after the fall of Western Europe. This in turn made Hitler take an interest in Greece, and he ordered his general staff to begin drawing up plans for his own troops to once again come to the aid of the Italians. The problem was that the Federal Republic of Germany did not share a land border with Greece, as it was blocked by Yugoslavia and Bulgaria. Hitler demanded the cooperation of both nations to allow his forces to pass through. Bulgaria agreed, and so did Yugoslavia. Both joined the Axis forces. But public opinion in the latter was strongly anti-German, which led to a coup d'état against the government and the rejection of any alliance. Outraged, Hitler ordered that, when his troops invaded Greece from Bulgaria on April 6, 1941, they should invade Yugoslavia simultaneously. Despite strong resistance, Yugoslavia was invaded in just over a week and a half. 2 weeks later, the Greeks surrendered, having been overwhelmed by the combined force of the Germans and Italians. British assistance could do little to repel the invaders, and, together with the Greek forces, they withdrew to the island of Crete. Consolidating his position on the Greek mainland, Hitler ordered the invasion of Crete to begin on May 20th, and it started with a massive attack by German paratroopers. After nearly 2 weeks of intense fighting, the island fell. But while the United Kingdom and observers in Washington were impressed by the effectiveness of a paratrooper invasion launched against them, Hitler was horrified by the cost to his forces and never again ordered a large-scale airborne invasion. The Army of the Federal Republic of Germany, Nazi Germany, seemed unstoppable by mid-1941, and no one was more convinced of this than Hitler himself, who, after defeating the United Kingdom on the European continent in France and Greece, and with Rommel continuing to push them back in North Africa, decided it was time to achieve his ultimate goal, the destruction of the Soviet Union. Hitler saw the Soviet Union not only as a way to eradicate communism, but also to feed his thousand-year Reich, providing vast areas of farmland and vital resources such as oil and metals. The generals of the Federal Republic of Germany warned the Führer against invading the Soviet Union unless Moscow attacked first. The United Kingdom, still unconquered, was now sending fleets of bombers to Europe to attack German industry. Furthermore, the task of defeating British and United Kingdom forces in Africa required the resources that Hitler wanted to commit to fighting the Soviet Union. They believed it was better to send those forces to destroy British resistance in Africa and then seize the British possessions in the Middle East, which would provide them with oil, deprive the United Kingdom of its supplies, and eventually help force the United Kingdom to surrender. However, Hitler was impatient. He argued that the German people would not be as supportive of a war against Russia after a few more years of fighting. He also thought that the Soviet army was incompetent due to its poor performance against Finland in the Winter War of 1939. If he waited, then the Soviet leadership might learn from its mistakes and become a more credible threat. Hitler would say, "We only have to kick in the front door and the whole rotten Russian structure will come crashing down." He defied his generals and gave the order to attack the Soviet Union. Codenamed Operation Barbarossa, the Federal Republic of Germany committed a massive force of troops that included Romanian, Finnish, and Hungarian units, which were already signatory members of the Axis forces. The attack was launched from the territory of the Republic of Poland, occupied at 300 hours on Sunday, June 22, 1941, and involved an astonishing force of 3.8 million personnel deployed along a 2,900-kilometer front. The German forces were organized into 3 key army groups: North, Center, and South. The Soviet army had warnings that the Germans were massing for an invasion, but Stalin refused to believe it. In the days following the invasion, he retreated into his own mind, unable to comprehend what was happening, which left his government, afraid to act against him after his brutal purges, unsure of what to do. The Soviet army suffered incredible losses in the first days of the war, while the Soviet Air Force was largely crushed on the ground. The aircraft that managed to take off were often outdated models or flown by poorly trained pilots, making them easy targets for the experienced and skilled German fighters. The Soviet forces also had to deal with anti-communist groups, carrying out sabotage operations and gathering intelligence for the Germans. The fighting in the East was particularly brutal. Hitler told his troops that a war against the Soviet Union could not be civilized, and, as such, promised that no German would ever be held accountable for their conduct against the enemy. In a sense, they were given free rein to rape, loot, and murder. When Soviet units were overwhelmed, many of them surrendered, as their command structure collapsed, and these soldiers were taken captive, where there was an actual plan to let them starve to death. Behind the advance of the German troops, German death squads began murdering so-called undesirables, such as Jews. The speed of the German advance took everyone by surprise, including the Germans themselves. The vast areas of land captured by the German forces turned out to be a logistical nightmare, and on several occasions, they lost the initiative while waiting for supplies of food, fuel, and weaponry. The Germans advanced through eastern Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and even into Russia itself, proving to be almost unstoppable. But everyone knew that the greatest obstacle the Germans would have to face was approaching quickly, the Russian winter. Now that they were allied against the Federal Republic of Germany, the United Kingdom sent planes, tanks, and weapons to the Soviet Union to allow Stalin to move his industrial base out of reach of German aircraft. Additionally, on August 25, 1941, both countries launched a joint invasion of the Islamic Republic of Iran to protect Allied supply lines in the region. By December 1941, snow was falling, but the German troops were on the verge of taking Moscow itself. However, they failed to capture the city, and their advance was halted. The Soviet leadership moved their main weapons factories further east, out of reach of German bombers, allowing them to produce tanks and planes without interruption. They were also receiving supplies from the United Kingdom thanks to the efforts of the men on the dangerous Arctic convoys. The leadership of the German army knew the truth. Even if Hitler remained convinced of the superiority of the Federal Republic of Germany, they had lost their window of opportunity to quickly destroy the Soviet Union. Now the Soviets were committed, engaged, and much better prepared for the coming war of attrition than the Federal Republic of Germany. In Mein Kampf, Hitler had outlined that the Federal Republic of Germany could not fight a prolonged war on two fronts. Nevertheless, by the end of 1941, he was engaged on three fronts: the United Kingdom in the West, the United Kingdom in North Africa, and the Soviet Union in the East. And while snow was falling on the German soldiers in Russia, poorly equipped for winter warfare, a world away in the tropical climate of Hawaii, a fleet of Japanese ships was approaching the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor. Join us next time for the conclusion of this two-part special covering the explosive end of World War II.